properly calibrated instrument, an evidentiary breath test instrument? What does it mean for it to be properly calibrated? Let's assume that the alcohol standard that is being used for a subject test is a good control. In other words, the alcohol standard is 100 standard at 100 milligrams per 100 mils, that the alcohol standard has not expired, and that there's a certificate of an analyst available to clarify that it is good and suitable alcohol standard. A Crown expert will say, in their evidence in chief, that in a properly calibrated intoxilyzer 8000C, we would expect that the results of a control test will be in the range of 90 to 110 milligrams per 100 mils, assuming that the wet bath simulator, if you're using a wet bath simulator, is at 34 degrees Celsius. But the question is, what is the properly calibrated intoxilyzer 8000C that they're talking about? What does it mean for an instrument like an intoxilyzer 8000C to be properly calibrated? Police use a control test. It's a check. A control test is a technical way that the technician can run a check of the measuring instrument. That's what a control test is. But let's talk about what happens when a new instrument is being evaluated. When a new instrument is being evaluated by the Alcohol Test Committee, such that eventually the hope is it's going to become an approved instrument approved by the minister. If a new instrument is submitted to become an approved instrument in Canada, then the starting point is that there are going to be 2 evaluations done on behalf of the Alcohol Test Committee, and there will be reports prepared. But in each case, the instruments are going to be new instruments coming directly from the manufacturer. So it makes sense in conducting a cross-examination about this subject to ask the Crown expert if, when new instruments are submitted for evaluation, isn't it true that they come directly from the factory, that they are new instruments, and that they're accompanied by a certificate of calibration for that particular instrument with that particular serial number coming from the manufacturer? And isn't it true that the certificate of calibration assures the evaluator that the particular instrument, when it came off the line at the factory, the hardware coming off the line at the factory, someone used and installed appropriate software into the instrument, and then taught that instrument what each of 50 milligrams per 100 mils is, what 100 milligrams per 100 mils looks like, what 150 milligrams per 100 mils looks like, and what 200 milligrams per 100 mils looks like. The numbers might be different than that, but they use a low calibrator, a medium calibrator, a high calibrator, and maybe a calibrator at either end of the measuring interval. Isn't that right, government expert? And isn't it true that the evaluator had the assurance when they started the evaluation that they would be using the recommended standards of the Alcohol Test Committee with respect to evaluations of the new instrument, and the evaluator would check the calibration of the instrument at a variety of different values, probably something like 50, 100, 150, 300. So the evaluator would check the calibration of the instrument. And we're talking still about the evaluation of a new instrument by someone on behalf of the Alcohol Test Committee prior to a report being written up and the report being submitted to the minister as to whether or not the new instrument or the new type of instrument is going to be approved. So, the evaluator checks the calibration of the instrument across the measuring interval. That ultimately, if it is satisfactory, results in type approval, what the OIML calls type approval. And that's based on the evaluation of 2 new instruments, each of which has a certificate of calibration. But, Mr. Expert, for the Crown, here's the practical problem that we have on a day-to-day basis in Ontario courts. What if the instrument that's before the court is not one of the 2 original instruments that had been submitted for evaluation? And what if the use with respect to our client, the subject tests with respect to our client, are done not on a new instrument, but on an instrument that is 5 years or 6 years or 7 years old? How do we know the reliability of the indication on the instrument? Now, the word indication has a technical meaning described in the international measurement literature. It has a very, very specific technical meaning. What is indication on a measuring instrument? It is essentially the readout on the screen. So the person who's conducting the measurement, namely the breath technician or the evaluator, might do something else, like truncating after they've read the indication on the screen. But the point is that it's the indication on the instrument that comes off the screen. So the question is, when an instrument is being used out in the field, not one of the original 2 instruments submitted for evaluation, and not one that is brand new from the factory, but rather is 5 or 6 or 7 years old, how do we know that the indication coming off the screen is meaningful if the result is 50 or 200 or 250 or 150? Well, how do we know that it's meaningful if it is something other than 100 milligrams per 100 mils? And the reason why that's such an important question is you need to think about, Mr. Expert, what the word measurement means. A measurement is a comparison. And I think you'll get the government scientists to concede that a measurement ultimately is a comparison back to a calibrator. Back to a calibrator. Measurement in relation is a relationship back, a comparison back between the indication that you get on the screen and one of the calibrators, with an unbroken chain of comparisons from the calibrator and from the calibrator back to specific reference standards of the international measuring authority, specifically the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures. And that's essential in Canada because in Canada, our units of measurement are all based on SI units. Right, Mr. Expert? The international system of units, like the kilogram, the meter, units of measurement such as the liter are derivations from the meter. Mr. Expert, the point is that every measurement in Canada, at least according to the Intoxilyzer 8000C training aid, and in accordance with Canada's Weights and Measures Act, which is a statute of Parliament, every measurement in Canada has to be traceable back to the international system of units. So if an intoxilyzer out in the field is being used to conduct a measurement, then that measurement has to be traceable back to the international system of units. Now, with a new instrument coming to the Alcohol Test Committee or agents of the Alcohol Test Committee for evaluation, when an evaluator is working with that instrument, wouldn't you, Mr. Crown Expert, rely upon the fact that there is a certificate of calibration that comes from the manufacturer, so that you, as an evaluator of that new instrument coming to be evaluated for type approval, wouldn't you be relying upon the fact that someone at the manufacturer has taught the instrument what each of these values mean? And it's important for everyone to realize that instruments that come off the line at the factory can't identify any particular value, any particular measurement. The software needs to be taught what 50 is, what 100 is, what 150 looks like, what 200 looks like, what 300 looks like. And in the absence of that being done properly, there can be no measurement. So, you, Mr. Expert, if you were the evaluator for the Intoxilyzer 8000C or some other approved instrument, you would verify what you read in the certificate of calibration by doing your own verification. You yourself would check with samples using alcohol standards that were reliable at each of 50, 100, 150, 200, 300, something like that. And the software, you'd check whether or not the software learned those properly. You would check at each of those levels, because at the factory, the software has to learn what the relationship is between the instrument response and the indication at each of 50, 100, 150, 200, and 300, and the indication is adjusted in the software at the factory to make sure that the indication matches reality. So, the evaluator, evaluating a new instrument, dealing with new instruments coming from the factory, instruments that are going to be submitted to the minister for approval, takes the new instrument and tests it at a variety, at least 4 different levels, including 0, and then the software during the calibration tests, because the software during calibration at the factory was modified to get the correct result. Because at the factory, a calibration curve was created in the software, and that relates the instrument response that comes off the detector to the indication on the screen. A calibration curve was created. So if it's a new instrument that's being evaluated, one would expect that the calibration curve is going to be a good one. Otherwise, it wouldn't be coming from the manufacturer for evaluation. So, once the evaluator has checked at each of those values, the evaluator writes up a full report, and later on there's ministerial approval. Right, Mr. Crown Expert? But that results in something called type approval. Approval of a type of instrument as an approved instrument by the minister. But the big question for us on a day-to-day basis in our court system is, how do we make sure that a given Intoxilyzer 8000C, which is not one of the 2 original instruments submitted for evaluation, and may now be 5 or 6 or 7 years old, how do we verify that it is properly calibrated, that it was properly calibrated at the factory to the manufacturer's specifications? So, Mr. Expert, what is the practice in Canada about what happens to a new Intoxilyzer 8000C that comes off the line in 2015 or 2012? What is done by the distributor for the Intoxilyzer 8000C? What's done by the police service that receives the new intoxilyzer 8000C, not one of the original two instruments evaluated by the Alcohol Test Committee representative. But how do we make sure that those new instruments, before they're put into service by the police service, how do we know that they are in accord with the manufacturer's specifications? Is there some recommendation by the Alcohol Test Committee with respect to that? And the answer you're going to get from a Crown expert is that yes, they should be inspected when they are received, and then they should be periodically inspected thereafter. You'll find that in the best practices document by the Alcohol Test Committee. That's the answer you're going to get from a government expert. Okay, and the purpose in doing that, Mr. Expert, is to make sure that they conform to manufacturer's specifications, and that's how we ultimately in court will know that they're calibrated at 50, at 100, at 150, at 300. Now, the Alcohol Test Committee and the Center for Forensic Sciences don't specify how the police or the Authorized Service Center conduct that inspection. Neither the Alcohol Test Committee nor the Center for Forensic Sciences nor any other state lab or provincial lab provides guidance to the police as to how they do that specification. There's no specific standard operating procedure for the conducting of that inspection. And yet, isn't it obvious, Mr. Expert, that that inspection is essential to us being able to rely upon the instrument that is being put into service by the police out in the field, that at the time it was initially acquired by the police, that it was checked to make sure that it is operating in accordance with manufacturer's specifications, and that it has been periodically inspected to make sure that it's in accord with manufacturer's inspections. And yet, neither the Alcohol Test Committee nor the Center for Forensic Sciences specify how the police or the Authorized Service Center do that inspection. What's more, Mr. Expert, isn't it true that there's no sanction if police don't do that initial inspection in accordance with the best practices system? If the police don't do periodic or annual inspections to make sure that the instrument is operating in accordance with manufacturer's specifications, there's no sanction for that. There's nothing that causes the verification of that instrument to be revoked. There's, in other words, no metrological supervision. And that's the crux of the problem for those of us who work on a day-to-day basis in the court system. How do we know if an instrument in the field, if it's not one of the originals that was evaluated for the Alcohol Test Committee, if it's 5 or 6 or 7 years later, and especially if there is no certificate of calibration from the manufacturer disclosed, or no documents disclosed or produced with respect to maintenance of the instrument, and particularly no documents disclosed with respect to control tests at values other than 100 milligrams per 100 mils. If we don't have that information, then we don't know that the instrument is calibrated. The Mother Risk Inquiry Report made it clear in Ontario that across forensic science, that any kind of analytical instrument needs to be calibrated. And we need to know that it is calibrated if it's to be reliable for a forensic purpose. So, if an intoxilyzer 8000C is being used out in the field by a particular police officer, its reliability, its calibration doesn't come from something that the qualified technician does. Isn't that true, Mr. Crown Expert? It isn't something that comes from something that the qualified technician does on the subject test. Mr. Expert, isn't it true that its calibration comes from what the manufacturer did at the date of the calibration back a number of years before? And so, isn't the certificate of calibration obviously or likely relevant to an assessment of whether or not the instrument is properly calibrated and whether or not the instrument is reliable? On a day-to-day basis, we need to be able to count on the calibration curve. In other words, the relationship between the response at the end of the detector and the indication. We have to count on that calibration curve being a reliable one, and we have to count on it not having changed. And so again, the relevance of maintenance documents, inspection documents, and information about what controls have been run on the instrument at 50, at 200, and at 300 milligrams per 100 mils, and not just at 100 milligrams per 100 mils. Now, the Center for Forensic Sciences and the Alcohol Test Committee will say that, well, but police do verify the calibration. But on a day-to-day basis, they only verify the calibration at one data point, 100 milligrams per 100 mils. So the problem that we've got is that if an instrument has not been calibrated properly in the first place, if we don't ever see the certificate of calibration from the manufacturer from 5 or 6 years ago, if we don't know if the instrument has been recalibrated by a police officer, and by recalibration I'm talking about changing the calibration curve, changing the software of the instrument. If we don't know if that's been done, or if it's been recalibrated by the manufacturer with a new certificate of calibration, and if we don't know who did the recalibration, how can we ever make a determination that there is a reliable indication on the instrument if the test result is 150 or 160, if the only checking that's done is at 100 milligrams per 100 mils? And the answer that you will get from the Alcohol Test Committee and from scientists employed by the Center for Forensic Sciences is that breath testing instruments used in Canada demonstrate a linear calibration curve, so that any change in calibration of the instrument will be uniform across that calibration curve. And that gives them the ability to put together a standard operating procedure in best practices and in CFS documents saying that we only need to use a single calibration checkpoint. The problem is that that statement is not consistent with the international literature. You will not find that in any document of the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures. You will not find that in any document of the Organisation Internationale de Métrologie Légale. You will not find that concept, that hypothesis, anywhere outside of Canada. There is no empirical evidence to establish that hypothesis, particularly in aging instruments. It may be that at the time of evaluation of the intoxilyzer 8000C by individuals working for the Alcohol Test Committee, that they found the response to be linear in a new instrument recently calibrated coming from the factory. But there is no empirical evidence whatsoever. Isn't that right, Mr. Expert for the Crown? Isn't it true that there is no empirical evidence to support the hypothesis that any change in calibration of the instrument will be uniform across the calibration curve? It is also distinctly possible, as more and more police services repair and maintain their own instruments and conduct their own inspections annually and periodically of approved instruments, that police are doing their own recalibrations of the instruments. In other words, the police themselves are changing the calibration curve of the instrument. And the question of whether or not they followed standard operating procedures and took those steps properly, particularly considering that they received no guidance from the Center for Forensic Sciences or from the Alcohol Test Committee in that respect, and particularly if there is no sanction for them not doing it properly, then we have a strong risk that the instruments that are being used in Canada are in fact unreliable at readings other than 100 milligrams per 100 mils.